All right, so welcome. So my name is Tellina di Giuseppe da Fiesole. I live in the barony of Rivenoak in the Principality of Sonagua in the Kingdom of the West. And today we are going to talk about olive oil. So you've probably got a bottle or two or more in your kitchen. But one thing that I learned working for an olive oil producer was that most people don't really know much about it, even cooks. So we're going to spend some time kind of getting to know olive oil as an ingredient, and then we're also going to look at some ancient practices in olive oil production. So I am still sort of towards the beginning of my research on this topic, just kind of tiptoeing into the rabbit hole, but I think it is really interesting, so I wanted to share it with y'all. So originally, when I said, I'm going to teach a class on olive oil because this is a thing I know about and this is a thing that relates to the SCA period. It's like, I'm going to teach a class. And I was like, oh, it'll be easy. I'm just going to do step by step. Here's what we do now. Here's what we did then. And so I was like, well, we're going to start with those ancient Roman agriculture guides because we have these beautiful, really well documented books. And so I was like, all right, so I'm reading, I read through Cato, and 110 million pages later about the exacting specifications of olive mills, we get to the actual pressing. And I'm like, yeah, we're going to get to the actual pressing. This is the part I'm interested in. And he's like, yeah, I don't know. I hire a guy. Oh, you hire a guy? Yeah, I hire a guy. And then as I'm reading more, it seems to be true of all of our major agricultural guides. So I was kind of a little bit disappointed. Both Cato and Columella, who have some of the most famous agriculture guides from the Roman era, they give kind of a vague executive summary, sort of how to watch an expert do a thing and nitpick them. Versus an actual detailed explanation, which is what they do in other sections of their works. But that being said, by looking at these descriptions, we're able to really kind of gain a lot of clues about what some of the characteristics that they valued in their oils were, and really draw some parallels between our modern preferences and their preferences in period so that we can sort of make decisions about the ingredients that we're choosing based on sort of what might be more or less similar. Holding up our ancient Roman accounts are going to be Cato, and Cato's name is Marcus Porcius Cato, or Cato the Elder. And he wrote De Re Agricultura, or on agriculture, on farming. You see it translated different ways, around 160 BCE. His work was widely read in his time and is referenced really, really heavily throughout Roman works. So we know that he was really considered to be sort of a peak of knowledge on this matter. Then we are going to look at Lucius Junius Moderus Columella. So Columella wrote De Re Rustica, which sometimes you see translated as on rural affairs, on agriculture, or you see it split up and on husbandry and on books, or on trees, sorry. So his work consists of 12 books, and it was written sometime prior to his death in 70 AD. So it is 12 books, and olive oil is addressed in book 12, chapter 50. His work was not as well read in his time or immediately following his time, but it was kind of rediscovered in the 15th century and published again. And then, so they both had commercial farms in the region just sort of south of Rome. And then, as you might expect, our boy Pliny has something to say about this. While Cato and Columella are writing what you could think of as like a textbook, Pliny is writing an encyclopedia. So he published, so he was a contemporary of Columella, and he published his natural history in 77 AD. And a lot of what Pliny has to say is, did you read Cato? But he does have some oversight, some views that are very interesting. And so these are the different translations that I used for my reference. I have to say this 1745 translation of Columella is delightful, kind of hard to read, but really interesting. All right, so the modern reference. So we're going to be talking about ancient and we're going to be talking about modern. So most of the modern information is the information I have from working in the industry. And then I've also bounced myself off of some modern resources. One of the biggest things that we're going to reference here is the USDA standards. And that is because I worked in olive oil milling here in the US and specifically in California, where we also have the COOC, which is the California Olive Oil Council. They are basically the strictest guidelines in the world for olive producing. So I will try to kind of pick out the places where there are big differences internationally. All right, so let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put some parameters. Move my little picture for the recording. We're going to put some parameters on sort of what olive oil is, and we're going to develop some common language. The reason, and we're going to start here in the future. And the reason we're going to start here in the future and spend a little bit more time on sort of the modern product than you might sort of be used to is that that's what you can get now. And it's all fine and dandy to have a great understanding of how it was done in the past, but understanding how it relates to the item that you can purchase now and use in your cooking now is, I think, a really important component that sometimes we forget about, how much agricultural products have actually changed. All right, so these are kind of our parameters on olive oil. So modern olive oil is sold in various grades. So extra virgin, virgin, and just plain olive oil are the ones that we're going to focus on. We're going to skip over blends. We're going to skip over the industrial grades because those aren't really relevant to what we're talking about here. So these grades, they aren't just marketing speak. They're actually really precisely defined. So they are defined using specific parameters, and those standards are going to include processing parameters, so how you produce it, quantitative testing, and qualitative assessment. And like I said, there are various governing bodies. I am looking at the USDA and COOC standards, which are the strictest in the world, but I will try and point out the places I know that they differ, because the standards in European countries do have some distinct differences. So the first component of olive oil grading for us is going to be production parameters. So sometimes you will hear words like cold pressing, first pressing. Those things are in fact marketing talk. The word that we're going to look for if we want to understand how our oil was made is virgin. If virgin is in the name, then the oil is required to be milled by mechanical means with no processing of the olives beyond washing and sorting. The resulting mash cannot be heated beyond what is required for processing, which is usually around 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Depending on the ambient temperature, we may be cooling or heating. It just depends. If virgin is not in the name, then the oil can be extracted using chemical processing of either olive mash or oil that is exhibiting an unacceptable level of defect. And we will get into what defects are. So that's our first criteria for grading olive oil modernly is going to be, was it made by mechanical means? If it's made by mechanical means without any additional processing, then it will have that virgin label. So those first right off the bat is going to tell us that because they weren't using heavy chemical solvents to extract oil in period, that we probably want to be focusing on oils that are extra virgin and virgin. All right, so the next component to grading is going to be the quantitative testing. So on this little table here from the USDA, starting at B, you'll see we have a lot of different sort of chemical analysis. So basically what happens is that a sample of oil from each production run is going to have a bunch of tests run on it. We're not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I did want you to understand that this is something that is actually really precisely defined. You can see that some of these standards are going to vary a little bit depending on the grade. And we're going to test the oil and make sure that it is within our expected parameters. The reason that we're doing these tests is that if it is testing outside of these parameters, it either means that it was improperly produced. So it could be processing, storage, orchard management. There's a lot of things that can impact the quality of the oil. Or it just has some other factor like a contamination or something like that, that is going to lead to a more rapid degradation. And it could be something that is not yet apparent when we taste the oil. All right. There's a lot of science on this that is lovely to geek out on. If you are ever interested, the USDA standards are actually a delightful read. All right, so more standards. All right, now we're going to get back into something that is a little bit more tangible. We've done all the chemical testing. We have said that it looks acceptable to us at this chemical level. So now it goes into a qualitative assessment. So the qualitative assessment is done using organoleptic means. Organoleptic means your senses. So there are two areas that trained tasters are looking at. So like in the component of flavor, they are looking for positive attributes and they're looking for negative attributes. Tasting is always done by a panel and scored using the median across the panel. So I actually had the pleasure of attending a course at the Robert Mondavi Olive Oil Center at UC Davis to learn the tasting process so that I could be part of our internal tasting panel at the mill that I worked at, because even just on a production floor level, we would convene a panel of at least 3 people to be able to really assess something. So in this little table here, we have the very first point is going to be the overall, and that is scaled on an excellent, good, poor, acceptable sort of scale. And that is basically a summary of the degree of positive attributes as well as the presence of any negative attributes. So on the positive side, they will look at what we refer to as level of fruitiness, which is just basically the level at which you have of positive flavor attributes. So flavors like an olive flavor, apple, green, yes, green, sweet, grassy, nutty, tomato leaf is another very popular one, green almond. So there are all these flavors that are considered favorable in an oil. And so they will taste these, and an oil might be very interesting and well balanced with a lot of different positive flavor attributes, but it might also have some positive flavor attribute, but it's all in one direction. Like, this thing is all grassy and nothing else. Modernly, what we would do with an oil like that is we can actually take various oils from different pressings and blend them together to get this beautiful, well-balanced oil that we really like the taste of. This is something that our Roman friends were very specific about not doing. They did not blend pressings, and there's kind of a reason, and it has to do with the way that they graded oils. But looking at something that is specifically a blend is going to be a piece that's going to take you a step further away from what the period product might be. All right, so now we get on to, so we've talked about the good stuff. Now let's get on to the negative stuff, because that's always more fun. So the negative flavor attributes are referred to as defects. This fun thing here is the defect wheel that shows the different types of defects. And so the thing about defects is that if there is a defect detected in your oil, if there is a defective flavor in there, that automatically drops it from being extra virgin. So you can come back from not having quite the right thing with the fruitiness. You cannot come back from a defect. So any level of defect is unacceptable for an extra virgin olive oil. And so the acceptable level of defect does differ a little for the regional governing bodies. So any defect means it can't be extra virgin. That is true pretty much everywhere. But when it comes to this virgin classification, which is good but has a little bit off about it, in the US, the median defect of anything below 2.5 is going to get you into that virgin category, but and anything above that renders it what we refer to as lampante, which is like lamp oil, which means that it's not really suitable for consumption without further processing. And that's the sort of thing that'll be chemically processed to make it into your very cheap olive oil that is not labeled virgin. And in a lot of other areas, you can actually have a defect as high as a 6 on the scale and still have it be acceptable for virgin. I think that is true through most of Europe. So that's just a little place where we differ. But the process of assessing is going to be really similar. So defective oil, these defects, they are not just flavor preferences. Like I could be like, I don't really like a bitter olive oil. That doesn't make it defective. What happens with the defects is they're actually giving us indicators of things that have happened in the processing or storage that are actually leading to a degradation of the oil. And so they're actually telling us really specific things. So the USDA has this very nice list that is going to talk about, these are some of our very most common defects. So fusty, muddy sediment, musty, rancid, and winey vinegary. And they have provided us with this very cool little table of what causes those. So fustiness, that is actually the taste that is associated with bacterial growth. Muddy sediment is the taste that you associate with rotting, right? Musty is going to be mold growth. Rancidity is actually the process that all oils, all fatty compounds go through of breakdown. So rancidity is the only one of these that will just eventually happen to 100% of oils, but it is associated with oxidation. And then winey vinegary is the defect that is associated with yeast growth. And so when there is a little bit of like a micro fermentation and it starts producing alcohol within the oil. All right, so that really kind of gets us to what our grades of oil and how we're defining them are for modern use. There were grades of oil in ancient Roman times. The specific parameters I definitely need some more research into, but the main basis of it is that they are actually going to be graded based on the quality of the olives. There we go. The quality of the olives at the time that they are milled. So damaged olives are going to give us our lowest grade of oil in Roman times. And then we'll kind of move through. One of the things that's going to give us a lower grade of oil is going to be very ripe olives. All right, so now let's take a look at how olive oil is actually made. So I have right here kind of an overview of the process. So olives are picked, they might be stored, they are washed. In modern times at the top, they are crushed, malaxed, and decanted. We're going to get into what all that means, but overall the oil is extracted. In ancient Roman times, they were milled and pressed. Our next step is going to be racking. In modern times, we may also filter. And then the final step with our oil is going to be bottling or storing it in some way. So let's look at each of these components and sort of walk through. All right, so picking. This is actually where our first clue to how similar period oils might be to modern oils is going to come into play. So olive trees live a long time. They can produce fruit for like 1,000 years. So when we are looking at selective breeding changes over time, which is one of the big components that changes what our food products are. We are talking about a naturally slower rate of change, particularly in the traditionally olive producing regions. It does get a little bit trickier though when we look at our newer olive regions, like California and Australia. California has actually been in the table olive growing game for a long time, but they're new to the oil. In those areas, the places without long-standing established traditions and infrastructure, you'll actually see a faster adoption of new technology. So mechanical harvesting of olives is actually really new. Like think the last like 20, 30 years. And so if you have been in an area that is a new olive growing region, you will actually see there are hedgerows of olive trees, and they actually use kind of a modified wine picking, like grape picking machine that drives over them and picks the olives. And so that is referred to as super high density. And so that's what our biggest olive companies are doing. And so the most common varieties that are used for that are called Arvekina, Arbesana, and Kornecki. But so if you see those labeled on a bottle, then it was mechanically picked. There's no reason that it wouldn't have been. But there are a lot of olive varieties that are still hand-picked. Basically any eating olive, anything you get in a jar or a can is actually hand-picked, which is kind of neat. The most likely ones you will see as an oil are going to be Mission, Ascolano, and Sebbiano. Those will be exclusively hand-picked. It's a good rule of thumb that if you can get it in a jar as an olive, that it is probably hand-picked. One of the caveats, though, is that a good table olive, a good eating olive, is not necessarily a good oil olive. So Columella notes for us that larger olives are better for eating and smaller olives are better for oil, which definitely holds true to my experience. So Cato and Columella note several varieties of olives, none of which I was familiar with in modern production, but I do understand that there are a few of these that are being grown as kind of heirloom varieties. And then Pliny lists something called Licinian olives that might be a precursor to Licino, which are a fairly common Italian olive for oil now. And when it comes to hand picking, we do have some varieties that get sort of partially mechanically picked. So they are pruned to a consistent size and then use sort of a side picker thing. But most olives that aren't fully mechanically picked will be hand picked. They can be picked directly into a bucket, right? So you can pick them into a bucket, or you can take sticks and beat the trees and knock the olives down onto tarps below. That is actually the way that is specified by Cato for picking olives in Roman times, is they are beating the trees with sticks, and they actually lay out reed mats underneath the trees and then collect the olives off of those. All right, so olives are typically picked slightly underripe for curing. So in this kind of olive ripeness chart, you're looking at sort of between a 2 and a 3, probably more on the 2 side for curing. And they're generally allowed to ripen further for oil. So on this chart, you are looking more around a 4. So for every different variety, there is a sweet spot that gives you the best flavor with an acceptable yield. So a riper olive will yield more oil, but it's less stable. So it has a shorter shelf life, and it often has some sort of off notes, like some less favorable flavors. So Cato tells us that the greener the olives, the better the oil, but that it will pay the owner best to have oil made from riper olives. So he is indicating that idea of higher yield, but inferior quality from ripe olives. I would say one of the most common flavor notes that I have heard for very ripe olive oil is cat pee. kind of not awesome. So in Roman times, an oil made from very ripe olives is going to be a lower grade. Okay. So Pliny also tells us that riper olives made kind of a greasy and less pleasant flavor. So Columella, though, he is really targeting in on that sweet spot because he's telling us that oil made from too green an olive is going to be bitter. So the producer that I worked for grew 16 different varieties. So we were actually in production from late September through January. Cato and Columella are only noting a few different varieties. And so Cato notes that the best production is kind of early December season. And then, so they're actually looking, they're going to pick when things are ripe, but they are looking for as, oh, sorry, brain. Columella tells us that we want to pick as soon as the fruit begins to show different colors, and that some are already black, but more are white. When he says white, he's actually not referring to green. He is actually referring to a breed of olive that is white, but it'll be similar to this picture here on the vine where you are on the tree where you have mostly green and a few that are purple. So they are looking at sort of doing a lot of production in December. That was also our heaviest production season. So I think where I am in California has a very similar climate. So the oils that we produce have very similar conditions to the oils that are produced in Italy. If we jump forward a few centuries to, well, a century and a half, to the Taconeum Sanitatis. I probably don't say that right. That's okay. Which is a book that talks about the different humoral qualities of oils. They actually tell us, they always say what is the optimum version of anything. And for olive oil, they actually say the optimum is from a good month. And so it is actually likely that they are referring to the harvest timing, because harvest timing was going to be the best indicator of quality in earlier oils. And so when we refer to a good month, or when you hear first pressing, they're not repressing the olives. What they are talking about is that one where we picked them at that peak perfect moment, the right amount of ripeness, because as you go further in the season, they're getting more and more ripe and the quality of our oil is degrading as we go. All right, so that was picking. Storage and washing. Okay, so the olive harvest and milling, it has to move quickly. So Columella tells us that you should actually have a store of firewood ready to go, collected prior to the harvest, because you can't call the workers away. They're working and they are working fast because they are trying to get those olives off before they get too ripe. So here's the thing, olives are fruit. And fruit rots. So the goal is actually never to really store olives. Modernly, we try to move olives directly from the orchard to the mill and really get them processed within 24 hours, but usually you're looking closer to 6. If storage is necessary, now it is done under temperature control. And so if we think back to those defects that we talked about, at this step, you can really introduce a lot of defects. So fusty, which is bacterial growth, musty, which is mold growth, and winey vinegary, which is yeast growth, are all things that you could be introducing to your olives at the point of storage, which is why we try to avoid storage. So both Cato and Columella recommend storing olives for as short a time as possible. Cato actually provides guidelines to his contractors that storage of a day is permissible. And if the olives are frozen on the trees, that 3 to 4 days are permissible, but that's probably just to get them back up to the temperature for pressing. Nowadays, if olives freeze on the trees, the oil made from them is considered defective. It has a very distinct flavor. It is likely that frozen olives in Roman times would have been a much lower grade of oil. So Columella, he echoes the need to move to press quickly, saying that each day's harvest should be actually pressed immediately. but he gives some details for storage to minimize rotting in the event that the harvest exceeds the pressing capacity. So his directions specifically look at reducing moisture. So it is possible that mustiness was kind of a larger issue for them with that kind of December harvest window. And then the next step is washing. We use water. They used water. There's nothing else. Nothing else touches them, just water. All right, so now we're getting to the actual extraction of oil. And here is where our ancient Roman friends get really fuzzy because they were hiring an expert. What Pliny tells us is that anyone can make wine, but that you have to have an expert to make olive oil. So our commercial farmers, which Cato and Columella are commercial farmers, this is not something done on a small scale. They are bringing in an expert miller. So that expert miller is not giving them the level of access and detail that they might have when they're talking about how to plant the trees and care for the trees. So this is the area where we have the most difference, but we are all working towards the same end, like what we do modernly and what the Romans did. So modernly, our process is going to be crushing, malaxing, and decanting. So we use mechanical grinders. So they are masticating grinders usually that are going to grind up the olives. And then we take that resulting mash and we do something called malaxing, which is basically, we're going to agitate it in a temperature controlled vat to encourage separation between the solids, the moisture that's in there, and the oils. And then we're going to decant. Decanting is generally actually done in a giant centrifuge, and they spin the oil super fast, and that separates the oil from all of the solids as well as the water. So it is very, very modern equipment that is used for this, but the process is going to get us to the same place as our Roman friends who are going to mill and then press. And then I liked that Cato went off on a whole thing about something with a shell. I think it was Cato, might have been Columella. So some of their steps are a little bit unclear because, again, I think they are trying to describe something that is somewhat proprietary to the person they have hired, but based on their equipment and their requirements listed, it sounds like the olives would be pulped in stone mills, which could be adjusted very precisely to make sure that you are never crushing the pit, because that they are telling us will introduce a bitter flavor to your oil. And then we'll take the pulp that comes out of those stone mills, and they're actually going to press it through baskets to remove the solid particulates. The oil that flows from the presses is collected in vats, although there was some mention of moving it with a shell. I like to picture that. I don't think it is how I picture it. I think it's a scoop. So where modernly we have this crushing and malaxing as two different steps, we have ground up the olives and then we have heated and agitated them. Milling in a stone mill is going to give you the same process. So it is going to heat them very slightly with the friction, and it's going to do the same thing to encourage separation as the two-step process that we use now does. All right. So now we are back with details. The experts did not let them extract oil, but oh, did they let them rack. And boy, do Cato and Columella have a lot to say about racking. So if you have done any brewing, this is the same concept as racking in brewing. But basically, we are gonna allow the oil to sit in a container, and it's gonna let any of the sediment sink. And then you're going to pull the clean oil off the top. And you're going to repeat that as many times as is necessary. That clean oil is always going to go into a very clean, brand new vat. So this process, you do it as many times as necessary. Modernly, you're going to rack maybe 2 or 3 times is sort of normal, because we have those same fancy centrifuges. We don't have as much particulates in our oil to begin with. So Columella seems to indicate 10 rounds of racking. And Cato recommends, if possible, to draw the oil off twice a day, because the longer it sits on the dredges and pulp, the worse it will be. And his equipment list indicates about 12 moves. So remember, in our defects, we had this defect that was muddy sediments. And that is it's basically the solids inside of the oil rotting. And we don't want that. This is something that our ancient Roman friends were very focused on. They are pulling our oil off of the sediment. And so each subsequent racking is going to give us a clearer oil. And the other component that can also happen is this winey vinegary, where we have too much sediment and too much moisture in our oil, and it'll actually start to ferment. So both of those things, it is clear from the level of detail and that Cato and Columella are putting on this, that this is a big concern for them, and they understand very clearly what the chemical process happening there is. So one component, though, that will differ between the ancient and the modern process is that as we rack, we're only racking a couple of times, but as we rack, we're introducing air into the oil, and that can actually speed up the, it increases oxidation, which is going to actually speed up the rancidity process. All oil will go rancid, but you can make it go rancid faster if you shake it up a lot. So modernly, a lot of producers actually also, they filter the oil instead of racking it. So when I worked at Lucero, we racked in the traditional way, but we bought a filter because we're like, could this move our product like from harvest to bottling faster? But we wanted to be, we were a very, very boutique olive oil maker. So we really wanted to make sure that the quality was there. So we actually did a side-by-side comparison with both the chemical analysis and the organoleptic assessments. And we found that the mechanically filtered and the racked oils were almost identical when we took oil from the same pressing and sort of split it out into the two different processes. There was really almost no difference. When you buy oil, you are not going to know whether it was traditionally racked or filtered, but it doesn't seem to make a big difference. All right, so on to kind of our last step of making oil is going to be storage. So modernly, bulk and bottled oil is stored in a temperature controlled environment. We used 68 degrees Fahrenheit. That's pretty common. So Columella actually notes the use of an oil cellar. So he probably, which would probably have provided a similar sort of temperature stabilization for their storage of oil. So on completion of the racking process, Cato and Columella note that it should be stored in clay vessels. So there's a few examples of amphora here. There are amphora of various shapes and sizes that have been recovered all over the Mediterranean area with remnants of olive oil in it. Very cool book. I've been reading up on that. So you will notice actually that in a lot of our modern bottles of oil have tinted glass. That is actually going to help filter out UV damage. And so it actually serves a similar purpose to the Romans had glass bottles. They chose to primarily put olive oil in clay vessels. And so Pliny tells us that he gives us a time frame of 1 year for consuming your oil. So you should finish your oil as the new harvest is coming in. So they've got about a 1 year shelf life. Modernly, we've got about a 2 year shelf life. Probably the biggest component that changes that is that we can get a much clearer oil. So we can filter out sediment through our decanters and through our racking process a lot more efficiently. So that is kind of where I'm leaving off our rabbit hole for today. I am going to go ahead and stop the recording pretty soon here. And then we can talk about any questions that you have. So I'm gonna, how do I stop the recording? There we go.